Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping into some fascinating source material.
We are. It's centered around excerpts from Surah Al-An'am, that's chapter 6 of the Quran, specifically verses 154 through 159.
And crucially, we also have these specific interpretive notes provided right alongside the verses.
Yeah, and those notes are really key, aren't they? Our mission isn't just, reading the verses.
No.
It's about unpacking what these verses, combined with these particular interpretations provided, reveal about divine guidance, accountability, and judgment, strictly according to the source material we have.
Exactly. It's this combination, the sacred text itself, and then these, well, quite pointed notes that seem to guide how we should understand who's being addressed, what certain terms mean.
Yeah.
Within this context, of course.
And looking at the verses themselves, they seem to sort of move through different themes, like guidance sent in the past.
Right, then the current revelation.
And then how people respond or are expected to respond to it. Yeah.
And you mentioned one of the notes offers a particularly maybe surprising insight.
Yeah.
About a group being addressed later on.
Yes, it definitely gives a very specific identity, which significantly shapes how you interpret those later passages if you follow the source's own explanation.
Okay, let's dig in. So the source material starts off by describing divine guidance sent previously. Verse 154, it focuses on the scripture given to Moses.
Mm-hmm. And the interpretive notes right there are pretty clear. They identify this as the Torah and state it was specifically for the Jewish people.
And the source describes it really powerfully. It says it was completing favor on those who do good.
Detailing every
guide, a mercy. And the purpose, it says, was so people might gain certainty about meeting their Lord.
And that note you mentioned, it also clarifies something important for later verses. It explicitly says that when the text mentions the two groups before us, it's referring to the Jewish and Christian people. The Torah for the Jewish people, the Gospels for the Christian people, that's the framework the source sets up.
Got it. So that acknowledges these earlier divine messages. Then, verse 155, it shifts. It introduces something new. This is a blessed book we have revealed.
Right. And given this is Surah Al-An'am from the Quran, the implication within the source is clear. This blessed book is the Quran, the current revelation being presented.
And what's the instruction that comes with it?
It's direct. Follow it and be mindful of taqwa is the word used, and the stated purpose so that you might receive mercy.
Okay. Follow this book, be mindful, receive mercy. Seems clear.
Pretty clear directive regarding this message, yes.
Now, this is where it takes a turn, isn't it? The source pivots, and the next verses, especially when you factor in those specific notes, they really zero in on accountability.
They do, and removing excuses, it seems, for people who might resist this new message.
And this is where that crucial note you mentioned earlier comes into play, the one defining a specific group.
Exactly. This is probably the most, let's say, distinctive interpretation provided in the notes we have. They explicitly define the pagans mentioned in verses 156 and 157.
Okay, and how does the source define them?
The notes state, quite specifically, that this term refers to people of Islam who worshipped idols.
Wait, hang on. So, according to these notes provided with the verses, the term pagans here isn't aimed at, like, outsiders. It's directed specifically at a group identified within the people of Islam, who are also described as worshiping idols.
That is precisely what these source notes assert, yes. They even elaborate, stating these passages are directed toward these specific people of Islam, calling them ignorant pagans in this context, and then concluding they have no excuse for not knowing about what is said by Allah in the Quran.
Wow. Okay. That definition provided by the source itself really changes the initial read, potentially.
It fundamentally frames who the source intends these verses to be addressing.
So understanding that the source is addressing this specific group, these ignorant pagans, also described as people of Islam who worshipped idols, what are the excuses the source says they can no longer make?
Well, verse 156 tackles the first one. The source says they can no longer claim that scriptures were only revealed to those two groups before them.
The Jewish and Christian people.
Right. They can't say, oh, we didn't get a book, and we were unaware of what those other books taught.
And that excuse is invalid because...
Because verse 155 just established that a blessed book has now been revealed to them. The source is effectively saying, you received your guidance now.
Okay, excuse one removed. What about the second one?
Verse 157 deals with that. They can't say, well, if scripture had been revealed to us, oh, we would have been much better guided than they were.
Sort of like a hypothetical claim of superiority, if only they'd had the chance.
Exactly like that. Like, we wouldn't have made their mistakes.
And how does the source counter that?
Verse 157 dismisses both excuses quite forcefully. It says, "Now there has come to you from your Lord a clear proof, a guide and mercy." It directly links back to that blessed book from verse 155.
So the source is saying the proof is here, the guide is here, the mercy is here, you have it. No more what ifs.
Precisely. The conditions they might have hypothetically wished for have, according to the source, been met.
And for this specific group, as identified in the notes, these idol-worshipping people of Islam, what does verse 157 say happens if they deny Allah's revelations and turn away?
The language in the source is very stark. It identifies them as the ones who do the most wrong.
The most wrong.
Yes, and it states they will receive a dreadful punishment specifically for turning away from these revelations after they've come.
So the consequence for denial for this group in this situation is presented as extremely severe.
According to this source, yes. Very high stakes attached to accepting or rejecting this clear proof.
Right, so that covers the accountability aspect for rejecting the message, aimed particularly at that group defined in the notes. The last two verses we have, 158 and 159, they seem to shift the focus slightly, don't they?
They do. Verse 158 looks towards future consequences, or maybe signs. It asks, rhetorically, what are the deniers waiting for? Angels. Lord. Some major signs.
What's the point it makes about waiting?
It basically sets a deadline. It says that on the day these major signs arrive, believing won't help anymore. Not for those who didn't believe before the signs, or those whose faith didn't translate into good deeds.
So a window of opportunity that closes.
Seems to be the implication, yes. The verse ends simply with wait, which sounds quite ominous in context. It emphasizes acting before those signs.
Okay, so that's still linked to denial and its ultimate end. But verse 159 feels different. It's addressed to the prophet. The translation uses, "O prophet," and it talks about those who have divided their faith, split into sects. This isn't quite the same as outright denial, is it? It feels more internal.
That's a really important distinction the source makes here, yes. Verse 159 shifts from the issue of external rejection by that specific group to the problem of internal fragmentation within the faith community itself.
And what does it say about the prophet's role regarding these divisions?
It explicitly states that he, the prophet, is not responsible for those people who create sects and divide the religion. You are not associated with them in anything, is how the translation puts it.
So it's not his burden to bear, according to this verse.
Correct. It clearly separates his responsibility from their actions of division.
And their accountability.
Yeah.
Where does that lie, according to the source?
Their affair, it says, rests only with Allah. He's the one who will ultimately inform them of what they were doing.
So a divine judgment specifically for causing internal division, separate from the judgment for outright rejection.
That's the distinction presented in this verse, yes.
Right. Okay, let's try and summarize the key takeaways from this specific set of sources, the verses, and those crucial notes.
Okay. Well, we started with divine messages, both past ones, like the Torah, acknowledged as guidance for the Jewish people.
And the current blessed book, presented as complete guidance and mercy. Implicitly, the Quran.
Then we saw how the source specifically addresses and dismisses potential excuses for not following this current message.
And this was targeted, according to the notes, at a very specific group, people of Islam who worshipped idols, who the source notes refer to as ignorant pagans.
Yes, stating that the proof had come to them, removing those excuses.
And the source clearly lays out severe consequences, a dreadful punishment for denying or turning away from these revelations by that group.
But then distinctly, the source addresses internal division splitting into sects, and it frames that differently.
Right, not as the prophet's responsibility to fix, but as something subject to Allah's judgment alone.
That specific and perhaps unexpected definition of pagans provided in the notes is definitely a standout interpretive point from this material we examined.
It really is. So this deep dive, based purely on these verses and notes, gives us a particular perspective on divine communication, human responsibility.
And the different implications, as presented here, for outright rejection versus internal division within the faith.
So thinking about that distinction, here's maybe something interesting for you, the listener, to consider, drawing directly from this source material. The final verses we looked at describe different types of accountability. There's the severe consequence laid out for those who deny or turn away from the revelations, verses 157, 158, particularly that group identified in the notes. And there's the separate mention of judgment solely by Allah for those who divide their faith and split into sects, verse 159.
Yeah, two different scenarios, two different judgments described.
So what might this distinction, as is presented right here in the source, imply about how these different forms of, let's say, dissent or departure from the core message are viewed within this specific text and its accompanying interpretation. Something to definitely mull over.